All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Hi, folks. I am not Evie Blumenberg. I am Hattie Frozen, Deputy Director at the Lewis Center, and I am standing in for Evie today. She is unfortunately out of town and won't be able, and looking is sad, Roberto, to miss this, but glad that we were able to record and engage with this topic. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker today, and then he'll present, and we'll have a chance for Q&A. Roberto Requejo is an urban planner with a specialty in community development, public transportation, and DEI efforts, who has led the organization Elevated Chicago since 2017. Elevated Chicago co-led the creation of Chicago's Equitable TOD policy and pilot projects that touched a lot of different aspects related to development around transit stations, including affordable housing, small business development and stabilization, public art and grocery stores. Their efforts that they partnered with the city of Chicago led to the adoption of Chicago's Equitable TOD ordinance, which passed in 2022. This is really, I think, one of the leading efforts in the country around trying to make sure that when development is happening around TODs, it's really done with the community in mind and having a lot of being able to harness kind of that development for community good. Prior to Elevated Chicago, Roberto's professional background is working in the banking industry and regional planning, including work with the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, the Chicago Community Trust, and the Metropolitan Planning Council. Roberto was born and raised in Spain and immigrated to Chicago in 2001, and his educational background is in political studies and urban planning and policy. So let's welcome Roberto, and I'll turn it over.
Hey, everyone, thank you for being interested in this topic, and thank you to UCLA for this very generous introduction. I'm not gonna go too far into who I am because that was a really great, summary there. I would say though that hey, I am an urban planner. I truly believe in the power of transportation to do many things at the same time, in public transportation in particular, being able to address climate change, public health issues, but more importantly, equity and access. And, a lot of people out there proudly say, I'm a product of the public school system. And I like to say that I'm a proud product of the public transportation system. I wouldn't have access to first education and then jobs, neither in Spain nor here, if I had not had access to reliable and very affordable public transportation, because I have never owned a car, and I was unable to own a car for a very long time, and I was able to survive first and then thrive. So with that, I'm going to see if I can share some quick slides. How's that?
Very good.
Great, thank you. So for today, I wanted to leave enough time for conversation. So what we decided to do is to give you a quick taste of Elevated Chicago, the organization that I lead here in the city of Chicago. And first talk about what ETOD is, Equitable Transit-Oriented Development. Then tell you a bit more about our organization, who we are, what we do, and then end with what it takes to ensure that equitable transit-oriented development is present in a city like Chicago. Before I go there, I want to ask the class, how many of you are familiar with the concept of equitable transit-oriented development? Great. Thank you. And how many of you would be able to, impromptu, give a presentation about equitable transit-oriented development? Awesome, great. So, thank you. So hopefully by the end of the presentation, you all will feel comfortable doing such presentation, because one of the things that is important is that we as planners, as engineers, as community residents are able to fully articulate what we think equitable development looks like and what it means to us to have this type of development built near transit. So with that in mind, let me start just with the basics, right? What is TOD? And TOD, the way that we discuss it in Elevated Chicago is really a different type of developing neighborhoods and cities. For a very long time, planners, government, financial institutions in the United States built car-oriented and car-centric cities, and that was intentional. And that type of development put cars and drivers at the center, and this has caused many problems. And some of them are more obvious, like traffic congestion, air pollution. Others are not as obvious, like physical and even mental health issues, and then escalating costs too for individuals, families, and cities. So all of these problems started to pile up. And a few decades ago, American cities and some planners started to experiment with a different way of growing cities and communities called transit-oriented development, or TOD. And this is a way of developing neighborhoods that centers pedestrians and transit riders, and that provides avenues and incentives to build neighborhoods that are more compact, more walkable, and better connected to multiple transportation options, like trains, buses, and bikes, and not just to one mode like cars. So if you think about it, transit-oriented development, or TOD, should be, in essence or by definition, more equitable than car-oriented development for many reasons, right? And one of them is that low and moderate income people are more likely to use transit. And another one is that almost 20% of Black households in the US don't own cars versus 7% of white households. And also 60% of public transportation users are people of color. So with all that in mind, right, one would think that when you build with transit in mind, and when you center transit in development, and you build around transit, you should be building for people of color and for moderate and low-income people. But you would be wrong. And this map here shows you what we brought to the table as a coalition 7 years ago when we started our journey. And the city of Chicago had passed a TOD ordinance in 2013, precisely to incentivize transit-oriented development and giving zoning bonuses and reducing parking requirements for developers to build near transit. And that ordinance produced thousands of homes closer to our transit network and connected to jobs, but it did so very inequitably, right? And if you look at the data, as we did, you realize that 90% of that new TOD went to the north and the northwest sides of Chicago and the downtown area and surroundings. And for those of you less familiar with Chicago, these are already wealthy areas. These are majority white, high-income communities, and some of them are rapidly gentrified communities too, with especially Latino populations and Asian populations feeling this pressure of all this development coming to them. And in those areas, that development was very unaffordable for low and moderate income people. And units of housing in these new towers of apartments and condos were too small for many working and extended families, especially for Latino families. At the same time, the rest of our city, as you can see here, saw almost no development near transit during that period, even with incentives. And many train stations in those communities are still to this day surrounded by vacant lots and vacant buildings. And again, if you are not familiar with Chicago, those areas that you see in this map without the dots are historical and majority Black communities in the south and the west sides of Chicago. And we have a pretty extensive network. So those areas that you see there, they all have functional train stations and multiple bus routes. And yet those are, again, surrounded by vacant land and vacant buildings. So we brought this to the table in the form, our narrative around why we needed to do things differently. We brought to the table these two types of displacement that TOD was not addressing or was even contributing to accelerate. We brought to the table displacement that is gentrification based. And one of the neighborhoods where we work, Logan Square, as you can see here, in those 2 decades, saw 25,000 Latino people leave the community, a highly gentrifying area. And then we also brought to the table displacement understood as disinvestment motivated, right? And these are especially majority Black communities in Chicago where people, after many decades living in the community, say, hey, I'm here paying taxes like everyone else, and I don't have the basic amenities. I don't have a restaurant. I don't have a good school. I don't have a park. I don't have access to jobs that are walkable. I don't feel safe in my community, so I'm going to leave the city of Chicago, or sometimes even the state altogether. One very staggering number is that in the past, again, couple decades, more than 300,000, that number there is outdated. Black individuals have left the city of Chicago. This is how these inequities look like in practice, right? On the left, it's a $300 million investment in that awesome train station, which is the first or the last, depending on how you look at it, of our red line train line. Huge, ridership, tons of buses that connect with it in the far south side, so a majority Black community in Chicago. And when this investment was put in place, there was no real community engagement, and there was no plan for developing around that station. And so this could have been a trigger of a lot of equitable development around it. And yet, as you can see, the station is surrounded by really dangerous highways and streets, a lot of car-oriented uses like drive-throughs, franchises instead of local businesses, low-density development, very little economic development. So that was the type of displacement that I was talking about, and the type of disinvestment and missed opportunities around transit that we brought to the table. On the other side, it's a picture of the before and after in the Logan Square community. So very vibrant, majority Latino community, lots of local businesses, lots of Latino families starting their journey in Chicago in this community. And when the TOD ordinance took place, these towers started to pop everywhere and erased, that local culture, and created the pressures on gentrification that I mentioned before. And this displacement, again, it was not just people, it was also businesses leaving the community and nonprofit organizations too unable to pay the rent. So we came together and we wanted to create a different definition for TOD, and one that centered the E of equity in such definition. And we wanted to do it differently. We wanted to do it not just with planners at the table, not just with financial experts and developers at the table. We wanted to develop the definition and the strategy with them, but also with public health experts and with environmental activists and with small businesses, but more importantly, with real people, the real people who use our transit, who have to wake up every morning and feel unsafe, waiting for the bus, waiting for the train, don't have reliance or reliable transit access. So we brought together a very diverse group of people, hundreds of them, to help us build a whole different understanding of what ETOD should be, and also to do a full revamp, because we realized that an ordinance with a couple of provisions, a couple of incentives was not enough. We needed something that were more robust than that, and develop, again, development that was done with community, not to community, development that was accessible for people, regardless of their race, their income, their ability, their sexual orientation, and development that was more reflective of what communities deserve and wanted to see. And there was a lot of ideation artists involved too in the process, and try to get Chicago out of that scarcity mindset into an abundance mindset. This is what ETOD looks in action. So fortunately, we do have some flagship, pioneering ETODs. These are two developments, one in Logan Square, the other one in the south side of Chicago, connected to transit, both like immediately adjacent to a station. And so we use this a lot to show people this is possible, and this is the type of development we want to see instead of what I showed you in the prior slide. So I've told you a little bit about what ETOD is for us. I want to tell you now more about who we are, right, and what we do. So Elevated Chicago is a coalition of community-based organizations, as well as city and region-wide partners. And they include the City of Chicago, our community foundation, a couple financial institutions focused on community development, a couple think tank, policy organizations, and then a lot of really great, authentic, and well-rooted community-based, neighborhood-based organizations, based in communities where they do have access to transit, but that transit is not working for them. It's not surrounded by equitable development, or it wasn't when we started Elevated Chicago. Fortunately, there is more of that now. And these include activists, this include small business organizations, this includes organizations that bring together development perspectives, so affordable housing developers too, that are based in community, as well as artists and organizers. So by design, our coalition, again, as I mentioned, was not going to be a coalition of planners or a coalition of developers. It was going to be a very broad coalition with a lot of perspectives from very different groups. And it was also very diverse by design. We wanted the table to look different from the usual tables of transportation and development, which are usually male-dominated, white-dominated, especially in Chicago. And because we had so much diversity at the table, one thing we wanted to make sure is that that diversity was leveraged for constructive things, rather than that diversity generating even more tensions and more destructive, conversations. So we agreed on these 5 values, and we still use these to this day. Whenever there's a conflict in our coalition, we go back to those values and think, what should we do based on this commitment that we have made in spite of our diversity? The other thing that makes us a little different from other types of, community development organizations is that we look at our work through these 4 lenses. But the racial equity lens is the most important to us. So through that racial equity lens, we look at public health indicators, climate resilience indicators, and arts and culture, like vitality indicators, and make sure that everything we do gets us to a point where the differences in Chicago are not the differences that exist today and that are reflected in that map that I showed you before, and in the very striking differences that exist in indicators between communities that are majority Black, for instance, and communities that are majority white, which, just to give you one data point, the life expectancy, for instance, between one of those wealthy communities I show you that were receiving development near transit, and one of the majority Black communities where we work, sometimes it's 20 to 30 years, 20 to 30 years in the life expectancy. So one thing that we are proud of is that we started small. We started our work around those 7 transit hubs you see on the left. We chose those 7 train stations in the Chicago Transit Authority network. These are rail stations. And we chose them because they represented the 2 sides of displacement I mentioned before. We had a couple majority Latino communities that were seeing a ton of that gentrification and a lot of pressure from development coming to their communities and residents feeling unprepared to handle all that speculation. And then also communities on the west and the south sides that had this other perspective on development being mainly disinvestment in their communities, assets being taken away from them over many decades, starting with, redlining, urban renewal, all that stuff, to this day, grocery stores being closed, housing being in disrepair. And we wanted to bring all these communities together also to have a table where we would look at the half-mile radius around those train stations. We call these E-hubs or equitable hubs. And look at that half-mile radius and think about what is that the community residents want here? What is that they don't want? And how can we organize together to elevate all these priorities and create a work plan that we then ask the city of Chicago and the people who have the power, the money, the narrative control to move us into an equitable city. From that 7 station hubs, I'm very happy and proud to report that our coalition, working really hard over 7 years, has now achieved a different type of Chicago map where we have 50 plus ETOD sites. And those 50 plus sites, as you can see, is a very different map from the one before. Those sites are located all around the city, from the far south to the far north side, from the west side edge to the loop, the business center of Chicago. Our structure, again, is very, because we're so diverse and we're very rooted in what communities want to see, and especially communities of color, we opted for a tables-based org chart rather than the usual pyramid that you see in most organizations, where you have the CEO and then a layer and then another layer. We wanted to do this differently, and we work through tables, right? At the center of Elevate Chicago is our steering committee, and the staff, we serve that steering committee, those member organizations I showed you a couple of slides ago. We have a few working groups that work in issues that are cross-community issues, so capital deployment, systems change, knowledge sharing. We have a leadership council that includes individuals that have a ton of power in Chicago, commissioners of housing, planning, transportation, CTA leadership, the head of our community foundation, and a few others. We purposefully told this leadership council that they were not here to advise us, but to listen to us. And so we, in a way, advised them on what's going on and not going on in communities near transit and what we need from them to remove obstacles and invest in community. And then we have also funded and set up a number of community tables. And these are groups of residents, small businesses, people who live, work, visit the communities I show you, and that come together to discuss, agree on work plans, organize together for equitable development around their train stations. And these are community tables that, again, include long-term residents, people who just moved to the community, small businesses, people from a university that is located in that community. They're very, very diverse and represent the interests of that community. So, so that's a little bit about who we are. I told you also a little bit about ETOD, and now I want to show you what it takes to build a ETOD in Chicago. And what it takes is concentrating our work around those 3 pillars that you see here. This is how we look at our work plan and how we invest our dollars and our time and our advocacy capacity. We realize that a lot of ETOD or TOD efforts are very place-based. They're very much about building this one location, this one building, this one bricks and mortar. Some of them are very process or policy oriented. We wanted to make sure that we don't forget the most important part, which is people, right? And with that in mind, we started our journey by investing on people-based work. And the target for this type of work are the people who live and work within the half mile of transit in Chicago. We have invested about $2 million to date in helping set up those community tables that I mentioned before, providing resources so people can show up, be properly compensated if they need daycare, Their kids can have daycare. If they need to take a day off, they get paid for that day off to show up and participate in the community table. We also funded a ton of resident power and organizing. And we had a program called the Equitable Development Ambassadors. And it's a two-way program where people from communities learn about what development is like and how do you get into the mix of people who are making decisions about your neighborhood. And vice versa, we got educated around what people understand as equitable development, what they need. We also have funded programs and projects to promote community-owned homes and businesses, as well as community benefit agreements to be signed and negotiated between developers and neighborhood residents. So that was our people-based work. Our place-based work is targeting the built environment around the half mile. On those stations, we focus on bricks and mortar, so we are supporting a lot of new development in Chicago or rehab near transit, but we know that the building alone is not going to make it. You have to make the walk to and from that building and the connection to the transit walkable, climate resilience, culturally appropriate and connected and beautiful. So we are supporting a large pipeline of developments now that are being built near transit with support by the City of Chicago's Department of Planning and Housing. Here are some examples of those new buildings and rehabs. We wanted to make sure that ETOD was not just housing and that we respond to the needs that some communities have that go above and beyond affordable housing. And a lot of folks are telling us we need small businesses here. We need restaurants. We need grocery stores. We need a health clinic. We have supported all that kind of work. And we also have created an initiative called Elevated Works. And what Elevated Works does is if you are a developer that wants to start a project in your community, and especially if you are new or you're a smaller developer, and this is the first or the second time you try this, we're providing you free technical assistance from legal to architectural to transportation planning to social media, community engagement support, so you can take that vacant lot next to the transit station, that vacant building, and transform it with support from a network of 18 TA providers. Also, as I mentioned before, it's not just about the bricks and mortar being equitable. The walk to and from the station needs to be also connected and beautiful, and also climate resilient. So we support a ton of green infrastructure near transit, and these are examples of our Nature Near Transit program, where we focus especially on how can we build green infrastructure and introduce plants to address one of the key problems in Chicago, which is flooding. And that unfortunately, you all experienced that this week in LA. Is something that is not only gonna grow, in our area. Another two issues that we tackle with these interventions near transit are air quality issues and also heat, which gets really dangerous in Chicago in the summer. And then also walkability and activation initiatives. We have made grants for neighbors to come together and reimagine the infrastructure around transit and those vacant lots that I mentioned through the lens of arts, through the lens of videos. We have a great TikTok series called Can You Walk There, where my team member, Janice Newsom, just simply walks around a train station and shows people what's working, what's not working in Chicago. And also we have La Placita, which is going to be one of the first plazas in Chicago built by community residents with their vision in mind and in the shape, form, and manner of a Latin American plaza. So I talk about place, I talk about people, and then our process-based work is also very important. That's the third pillar of what we do. And this is our systems change work. This includes policy advocacy to change the city's ETOD or TOD strategy and turned it into an ETOD policy plan. We brought together 80+ organizations and then engaged thousands of residents in developing such policy plan. Out of that plan came Connected Communities Ordinance, which was passed by 36 of our 50 other people in support in 2022. And instead of making a couple adjustments like prior ordinance, it was a whole revamp of our zoning code to make development near transit more affordable, easier to build, faster to build, and also safer. And we also multiplied by 2 the amount of land eligible for incentives from a 1/4 mile, which was the prior footprint, to a 1/2 mile. And then very important too, we push the city for ETOD investments. When we started, there was no ETOD plan, no policy around it, and no investments. After many years of advocacy, in 2021, the Department of Housing invested $800 million in ETOD focused on affordable homes near transit assets. Then our planning department followed suit and set aside $10 million. And more importantly, several departments included transportation adjacency as a key criteria to allocate grants, making, again, these investments more solid and sending a message that our investments in the city of Chicago are going to be now looked at through the lens of transportation access. We also developed community engagement principles and recommendations. This is a really important part of our work because when we embarked upon our journey, we went to many, many neighborhoods. We met with a lot of residents. And when we were asking them what they wanted to see and not see near their transit station, they have very clear understanding about, I want a grocery store, I want affordable housing, I don't want that eyesore in my community. But more importantly, they talked not only about what they wanted, but how they wanted to be developed. And so we started to compile those recommendations about how they wanted the city to behave. And that ended up becoming our booklet with community engagement principles and recommendations. And by the way, I think we sent a box of materials, so you should have access to a ton of that printed material on site. So I won't go too deep into that, but the idea is to have a set of principles that Department of Planning, Department of Housing, private developers, engineering firms, planners can bring to communities and say, hey, we're going to abide by these 8 principles, and this is how we're going to do it. And then we also funded a cohort of JEDIs, or Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion experts within the city of Chicago. These were leaders and managers in the different departments and the transit authority that just have never been given a space to talk about what equity meant for them and have never been given the tools even to implement that in their departments. In addition to that, as part of our systems change, we also advocate at the regional and the federal level. There is not a lot of ETOD policy at the federal level or programs, so we are pushing, especially the U.S. Department of Transportation and HUD to do better at that. And then overall, more public sector funding for ETOD, because it's great to have the city of Chicago on board, but we have about 300 municipalities in the Chicago region, and none of them has yet an ETOD investment program. So I hope this was not too overwhelming, and I hope you got a good tasting menu of who we are, what we do, and how we understand ETOD. And I have left the rest of the time open on purpose, just so we can have a conversation about your reactions, your comments to this, your own perspectives on ETOD, and any questions that I can help with.
Great, thank you.